Welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! History with Joe Giorlando. In today's video, we are going to take another look at the 2010 Nationals format and talk about what a lot of people consider the second top deck at the time, or at least the second most popular deck at the time, Infernities. Before we do so, you might notice if you've been watching all of my videos that I have a little bit of a different background for today. I'm always looking to make improvements with the channel, so please let me know in the comments section. Do you prefer the deck profile introductions with the poster in the background, or do you prefer the bookshelf? I kind of feel like this might be a little bit less cluttered. Seeing a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh! Imagery may have been a little bit overwhelming for some when I had the poster behind me, but that's just my opinion. Please let me know in the comments below. I always typically look at those comments and try to reply, and I would really appreciate any feedback on that. Anyway, going to the deck profile and a little bit of the introduction. Today we're going to take a look at Infernities. Now, Infernities has been a deck for a large portion of Yu-Gi-Oh's history after the release in the Shining Darkness in 2010. What's interesting, though, about this particular Infernity deck is that it's actually going to have the ability to max out on a lot of the combo pieces and even some of the control pieces, which would later be limited through banned and restricted updates. So this is actually going to be a deck where we're going to see 3 copies of Infernity Launcher, 3 copies of Infernity Barrier, and 3 copies of Infernity Archfiend. 3 cards that, at least at some point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, have seen restrictions on the ban and restricted list. As a result, we're going to look at Infernities at their peak. Now, even with that all taken into consideration, with the hindsight that we have, with the ability to look back over a decade later, I actually don't even consider Infernities the best combo deck of the 2010 Nationals format. I think that spot should absolutely be given to Frog FTK, a deck that we'll be profiling in the near future. But regardless of my personal opinion 10 years later about combo decks during the summer of 2010, we absolutely need to talk about Infernities and give them the due that they deserve, because when we're talking about popular decks in 2010, Infernities is right up there competing with X-Sabers. We saw both the X-Saber archetype and the Infernity archetype receive massive upgrades in the Shining Darkness, a set that was released soon after SJC Edison. A lot of people, when they think March 2010, associate SJC Edison, but Edison was only a small window, and unfortunately a small window of time. After the Shining Darkness, we saw all of these really explosive decks like X-Sabers with Dark Soul, and then Infernities with Infernity Launcher completely dominate the metagame. As a result, we're going to be looking at the summer of 2010, of course, after the Shining Darkness release. When we take a look at this format, there are obviously going to be those 2 top decks, but there are also a variety of other decks that Infernities are going to be competing against. Decks like Frog FTK or Frog Monarchs, decks like Herald of Perfection Lock, decks like Gladiator Beasts, maybe even to a lesser extent decks like Blackwing. If you registered Infernities in the summer of 2010, you absolutely needed to anticipate that your opponent was going to have main deck hate for your combo deck. I'm talking about main deck copies of DD Crow, which was borderline staple in the X-Saber variants. I'm talking about a variety of defensive spell and trap cards. And even so, if you're playing against Gladiator Beasts or X-Sabers, having to worry about cards like Cold Wave, which can have an absolutely crippling effect on your ability to combo off. And then out of the side, you have to anticipate that players would be ready for Infernities with a variety of combo killing pieces. More copies of DD Crow, maybe Crevice from the Dark Dimension or the Different Dimension. And as a result, if you were going to register an Infernity deck at this point in time, you needed to come prepared for counteracting that hate. And you'll see that a little bit with the side deck. We're going to have a very robust side deck that I think really tries to counteract a lot of the common cards that players side decked against Infernities. In terms of the deck list today that we're going to talk about, I'm going to call this the Canadian Infernity variant. I think many of the Canadians, particularly super friends, I'm talking about people like the Bolitos and Matt Petal and others, really popularized the main deck framework of Infernities, where in terms of emphasizing either the combo or control, there was almost this perfect middle ground where, yes, there's Foolish Burial and Dark Refer and reinforcements of the army, Infernity Inferno, all those combo either starters or cards that are very vital in actually setting up for the full combo, but then also incorporating a lot of control elements, defensive spell and trap cards like Dust Tornado and Bottomless Trap Hole, Book of Moon, to either elongate the game, maybe counteract something like a Thunder King Ryo, and ensure that the game progresses to the point where you actually can pull off this full combo, and then even in some cases defend your combo with something defensive out of the background. So as a result, I'm going to call this the Canadian Infernity deck, because the Canadians really popularized this particular variant of the deck. Though I will note, I'm actually going to incorporate a lot of inspiration from Europe when it comes to the extra deck. There was a big difference between extra decks that we would commonly see in the United States in North America as a whole, and then over in Europe, the Europeans really liked using Splendid Rose, a card that I actually really liked as well. It was a level 6 that it in and of itself, singleton, doesn't really do anything, but when you send a level 6 synchro to the graveyard that often is necessary for a combo, a lot of the times it's something like a Gaia, the useless level 6 no effect monster. Well, when you have Splendid Roses in your side deck, or rather in your extra deck, the first level 6 that goes to the graveyard essentially as a way of synchro climbing up to level 8, you can send particularly a plant Splendid Rose and make it so that subsequent versions of Splendid Rose actually have reasonable effects. Meld the two together and take a deep dive today at the 2010 National season and take a look at what was arguably the second most popular deck, certainly maybe not the second most powerful deck though, Infernities. We'll start the deck profile with 3 copies of Infernity Archfiend. Infernity Archfiend is a pivotal card that you basically need access to in order to win. It enables you to search additional copies of Infernity Launcher and of course Infernity Barrier when you're playing a bit of a control game. 1800 is also nothing to laugh at. You can very easily beat down your opponent, backed up by some Infernity Barriers and a single copy of Infernity Archfiend. We're going to be not only running the full 3 cards, we're also going to be running Dark Griffer, Infernity Inferno, and Foolish Burial, just to guarantee that we put this card in the graveyard so that we can recur it as much as possible. In order to do that recursion, we're going to max out on the full 3 copies of Infernity Necromancer. Infernity Necromancer is a pretty useful piece because sometimes in this deck you just simply need to grind out your opponent's back rows, and having this monster presumably stay on the board. Again, we're talking about a point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history where Solemn Warning had yet to be printed. So if this was on the board, your opponent basically had to torrential it. If they book a Moon, you could just flip it back up. Bottomless is only marginally useful. If this just sat on the board in defense mode, you can continually recur Infernity monsters from your graveyard and generate card advantage. And then 2000 defense isn't nothing to laugh at. This deck has a lot of trap cards to protect not only the Infernity Necromancer, but just your board in general. So you could very easily generate card advantage if you're not totally OTKing people and comboing them out. So we're going to run the full 3 copies to ensure that not only do we have a combo piece, we also have a card that works as a starter, a card that works as an incremental card advantage engine, and a card that's really pivotal to what this deck is trying to do. We're also going to run 2 copies of Infernity Mirage to continue that theme of recurring our Archfiend as much as possible. What's different about Mirage relative to Necromancer and why we're only running 2 copies is that you really don't want to draw Infernity Mirage early in the game because it's entirely dependent on having monsters in the graveyard. At least Necromancer has 2000 defense. Yes, its effect itself is dependent on having monsters in the graveyard, but you could reasonably stall out for a little bit with 2000 defense. Maybe that could wall a Thunder King Ryo, for example. You're not walling anything with Infernity Mirage. It's not a tuner. It's a level 1, 0/0. Cannot be revived from the graveyard, which means it in and of itself is not a card that you want early in the game. You want to fuel your graveyard a little bit, then have access to it. Or if you are going to open it early in the game, have access to Greffer or Infernity Inferno. It's also one of those cards that you really like to draw in the middle stages of the game. One of the things about this deck is it tries to run a critical mass of recursion cards so that mid to late game, if the game has reached that point, Archfiend's a great top deck, Necromancer is a great top deck, Mirage is a great top deck, Call of the Haunted is a great top deck, Infernity Launcher is a great top deck. We're talking about a point where 30-40% of the cards in your deck immediately start a combo. So running the 2 Infernity Mirages is a concession to acknowledging that the game will probably in some cases last to that point, and we want these combo pieces. It also combos really well with 100 Eyes Dragon from the extra deck and 1-for-1, which we're going to talk about in a few moments in the main deck. In terms of the tuners which enabled this deck to go and use the extra deck, there's 3 copies of Infernity Beetle, which acts as our level 2 tuner, and then 1 copy of Infernity Avenger, which acts as our level 1 tuner. Avenger's effect's not overwhelmingly useful. It does make it so that if your opponent attacks over an Infernity monster and you want to keep your Infernity Barrier alive, you can recur it from the graveyard if you have no hand. It would then go into attack mode in order to actually keep the barrier alive. So if your opponent had another monster, they could just simply attack over it. That effect didn't come up all that often, but it was useful to note. Its more important use was the fact that it was simply an Infernity, level 1 tuner. You can recur it off Mirage, off Necromancer, and of course off Infernity Launcher. Then we had Infernity Beetle. This card was not overwhelmingly popular in later versions of Infernities. This was more popular when Infernities first came out. But if you're unfamiliar with this card, you send it to the graveyard if you have no hand, which is of course a theme of the deck, and then you summon 2 more from your deck. And now you have 2 level 2 tuners. Comboing that with Infernity Archfiend, you can actually OTK from this point. If you're able to establish this board, have an Infernity Launcher, make a synchro play here, play the Launcher, you can actually OTK from that point. So it enabled you to make some OTK pushes, enabled you to access level 9 and 8 synchros depending on the circumstances, and really allowed you to play a pretty robust combo deck when you had the full 3 copies, as opposed to relying on just the single Avenger. But this is our Infernity lineup. The other monster, the non-Infernity, is Dark Greffer. Unfortunately, we're going to run 2 Dark Greffers. I say unfortunately because you absolutely never wanted to draw both of these. The Dark that you sent in order to activate Greffer's effect in a perfect world is one of the ones up here minus Mirage. You want to, either with this deck, want to put Archfiend in the graveyard if it's not there, and a tuner in the graveyard if it's not there. And if you already have Archfiend and the tuner, you can consider sending Necromancer or just putting another Archfiend to play around DD Crow. sort of the fourth priority, I guess, at that point would be putting Necromancer in the graveyard. But even then, you honestly want to probably keep these in the deck so they're good draws. Absolutely did not want to send Greffer off Greffer, though. You had to do it. It was a way of clearing your hand. But that was one of the shortcomings of this deck, is having access to Dark Greffer, and then the reality that occasionally in an event you would actually draw both of them. But nevertheless, this is our monster lineup. Moving on to our spell lineup, we'll start with the most important card of the deck, the card that was limited to 1 at the end of this format, and that is Infernity Launcher. This card is wild if you didn't play back then. What Infernity Launcher allows you to do is send an Infernity from your hand to the graveyard. That's just what it says. So if you activate Infernity Launcher, you could theoretically just send an Archfiend that's in your hand to the graveyard for no other effect, other than just to clear your hand. A lot of times when you had Dead Mirages, that was something that you honestly ended up doing. But you could just send an Infernity from your hand to the graveyard in order to clear your hand so that you could actually activate Infernity Launcher's second effect, which is to send it to the graveyard to recur up to 2 Infernity monsters from your graveyard. The thing with Archfiend is when Archfiend is special summoned and you have no hand, you can search your deck for an Infernity card. That includes additional copies of Infernity Launcher. So 1 Infernity Launcher, if you had Archfiend in the graveyard, and let's say any tuner whatsoever, would eventually turn into multiple Synchro monsters because each subsequent Archfiend would search an additional copy of Infernity Launcher, and you'd basically go through all 3 copies in one turn. Later versions of Infernities had to compensate for the limitation to Infernity Launcher, cutting it down just to 1 as a result of the ban list, and as a result there needed to be different combos in the deck in order to actually achieve the same type of boards. But at this point in time, we're talking about Infernities without any restrictions whatsoever, and as a result, we get to play 3 copies of Infernity Launcher. Next, we're going to run a lot of protection cards. So this is a combo deck, but it has a lot of controlling elements in order to actually survive to the point of comboing. We're going to run 2 copies of Book of Moon. Some versions actually played the full playset of 3. Book of Moon was useful because it flipped face down Thunder King Ryos. Thunder King Ryo really shuts down this deck because it'll stop your Archfiend searches. It also enabled you to just basically survive. It's one of those cards that can be used defensively. It also can be used a little bit more proactively. It's one of those really useful, versatile cards that's been playable for a good portion of Yu-Gi-Oh's history. You can flip down a Vital Tuner, for example, survive the turn, etc. Then we have the one-of spell and trap card removal. We had a Giant Trunade. This is, at its root core, a combo deck. You want to clear out your opponent's back rows. We have a Heavy Storm, same deal, and then we have 1 single copy of MST. This is at the point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history where these cards were all limited to 1. At the end of this format, there would be some changes. For example, Heavy Storm would be banned, but for now, just 1s across the board. Then we're going to look at some of the support spell and trap cards. We have Reinforcements of the Army, just to search our Greffer. That's the only target. All the Infernities are Fiends. We have 1 for 1. Technically, you have 2 targets for 1 for 1. You have both Infernity Avenger, which did happen. If you need to tutor out a tuner, you would absolutely do that. Or in a more ideal world, you would tutor out an Infernity Mirage, which is great because if you special summon Mirage from your deck, you've yet to use your normal summon, and you actually have the full graveyard with tuners and Archfiend and even Necromancer, you can make a really big board and then eventually use your normal summon on another Mirage that you would summon or search off of an Infernity Archfiend in the midst of your combo. So 1 for 1, huge combo piece. Also tutored out a tuner when you needed it. We already talked about Rhoda. And then we have a Foolish Burial to tutor out, depending on the situation, anything from an Archfiend to a tuner, maybe a Necromancer if you absolutely thought that that was beneficial. Next, we're going to talk about the traps. This deck has a lot of traps. As I mentioned, this is in many ways more of a control deck than you might think. We have 3 copies of Infernity Barrier. Infernity Barrier was a pivotal card because if this deck needed to play a control grind game, this was the way you were going to do it. You were going to negate the pivotal cards your opponent had while you usually sat on either an Infernity Archfiend, if you're relying only on main deck monsters, or an Infernity Doom Dragon, if we're actually talking about extra deck monsters. You virtually always could end by searching at least 1 copy of Infernity Barrier. And then if you already just naturally drew Infernity Barrier, you could use this to pick off cards while you're comboing. Like, for example, your opponent could try to DD Crow you, and you just barrier it, continue your combo, search another barrier, set it. You've got a bunch of synchros, barriers. Now your opponent's in really tough shape. So we're going to max out the full 3 Infernity Barriers. There are only a few very particular combos that allow you to actually search all 3 of these in one turn, which differs a lot from more modern versions of Infernities. But with this deck, we're generally going to end with just 1, but use any of the ones that we naturally draw to either protect our combo or even just make it so that we end with 2 Infernity Barriers. So we'll max out there. Next, we have 3 copies of Infernity Inferno. This is another one of those cards that, as Infernities evolved and progressed into later formats, you didn't see as much. This card simply has the effect of, you can send 2 cards from your hand to the graveyard, up to 2, 1 or 2, and send Infernity monsters from your deck to the graveyard. Sounds like in most circumstances, a pretty hefty cost to pay, but this deck can't function if it doesn't have Infernity in the graveyard. And what this allowed you to do is it allowed you to send pivotal Infernity from your hand to the graveyard, ones like an Infernity Archfiend or a Tuner, in order to put into the graveyard the other combo pieces that you needed. And then all it would take from that point is one of the 3 launchers, a Mirage, a Necromancer, Call of the Haunted, any of the recursion cards to make it so that you at least threatened the OTK or threatened an unbreakable board backed by Infernity Barrier. So this card was pivotal. It also enabled you to send cards from your hand at times your opponent might not anticipate to make it so that you actually got down to 0 cards in hand. Now, it's not like you could activate this, send cards, and then activate Barrier in that same chain. That's not really how Yu-Gi-Oh! Works. But you could make it so that your opponent begins their turn under the impression that Infernity Barrier is turned off, but then you flip Infernity Inferno when they activate maybe, let's just say for the sake of example, MST on one of your random back rows or Reinforcements of the Army, and all of a sudden you're down to 0 cards, and now your Infernity Barrier is live. So you could make some nice plays with that as well. You then have a lot of protection cards. We're going to have double bottomless trap hole. We're going to have a torrential tribute and a compulsory evacuation device. This deck needs to really make a lot of concessions for Thunder King. I made that comment already, so these are some of our Thunder King Ryo outs. We have a couple Dust Tornadoes. This was pretty common in the Canadian Infernity variant. Dust Tornado obviously picks off back rows. That's what it's always done. Kind of like Infernity Inferno, you can pick off a back row and then set something. This is a format where Heavy Storm is legal, so this deck wants to set a lot of back rows, but it can't necessarily always do that. So instead what you can do is set just Dust Tornado your opponent's 1 back row end phase, set Infernity Inferno, start your turn with Infernity Inferno, send all the Infernities to the graveyard, and then if your opponent had only set 1 back row originally and you picked it off with Dust Tornado, then you can go for an OTK or a big push. We had a Call of the Haunted, which in this deck acted as a starter or an extender. You could also technically chain this to DD Crow on, let's say, an Archfiend. You'd miss the timing off the Archfiend search, but you would at least keep it from being banished. 1 Solemn Judgment acted, as Solemn Judgment always has, as a way of allowing you to set multiple back rows without having to fear not only, honestly, just Heavy Storm, but Cold Wave as well. And then there's this 1 single trap Dust Shoot. Basically, any point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history where Heavy Storm is legal, Dust Shoot was really good. It's when Heavy Storm gets banned that Dust Shoots start to become a little bit questionable because people are more inclined just to set all their back rows. So if you don't open Dust Shoot, it's less likely to be live mid-game. But that is the standard main deck of Infernities at this point in time. We'll now talk about the extra deck before ending with the side deck. So with the extra deck, there are definitely some decisions that needed to be made, each player individually. So Armory Arm, absolutely essential. This deck can Armory Arm Colossal Fighter OTK. This was a point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history where you only needed 1 in order to do that. I know with later rulings, it either took like multiple Colossals or multiple Armory Arms. I forget how the new modern ruling is, but back in the day, all you needed was to summon Colossal Fighter and equip Armory Arm to a monster that had just 1 more attack point than Colossal Fighter, and you could ram and crash a Colossal Fighter, constantly reviving it in order to OTK. So this deck's going to run that Armory Arm because it can pull that off really easily. You can go Necromancer, Archfiend off of a Infernity Launcher. The Necromancer can revive Avenger. There's your level 8. Activate the launcher that you searched off the Archfiend. Bring back the Necromancer and the Archfiend. Search another launcher just for the sake of it. But then that Necromancer can revive the Avenger and then go into a level 4. And then you have level 8, level 4, Army Arm OTK. This deck used that quite frequently. So 1 single copy of Army Arm is essential. This deck needs some level 5s in order to go into level 5s off of Necromancer and Beetle. And then the way Beetle works, you often, depending on the circumstances, could go into multiple level 5s. You at least have the option. We're going to run Catastrophe because it was probably the best one. And then I forget what this one's called. It's like Stygian something. But it was a 2200 that enabled you to attack multiple times depending on the circumstances. So it was a pretty useful card. It was also a dark, which wasn't overwhelmingly important, but I guess something you could note. I will, when we finish talking about the ones that I think are staples, talk about some of the debatable ones, because depending on what deck you look at, you might see Big Fish and Magical Android as potential other level 5s, but we'll talk about those at the end. The next one to me is a little bit debatable. I was a huge fan of the European Splendid Rose variant, meaning a lot of the American players for generic level 6s, which actually were pretty important, ran Gaia, the no effect 2600 monster. I actually preferred giving 2 spots in the extra deck to Splendid Rose because it enabled you to OTK with combinations of cards which might not OTK on already. So we'll talk a little bit about why I think the double Splendid Rose package is better than Gaia. But definitely 2 of those, at least for me. Other level 6s, Bryanek. I mean, Bryanek is an incredibly powerful synchro monster in general, but just imagine when you have all those dead monsters and you can just discard all of them to bounce all of your opponent's cards, then activate Launcher and win the game. Bryanek was incredibly essential, not just because it was an unbelievably powerful level 6, and this deck can easily go into it with Beetle plus Launcher plus Archfiend, some combination of those cards, or even just having those monsters remain on the board over multiple turns. It allowed you to clear your hand, which was pivotal. We have Goyo Guardian, which at this point was just limited to 1. That's why we, a few moments ago, started talking about running a random no-effect Gaia. Black Rose is really debatable. This deck very rarely either wanted to go into a level 7 or even had the ability to go into a level 7. To go into a level 7, you basically needed to go Necromancer, Necromancer, Avenger. That's one way. Or go into a level 5 and then go into a Beetle, which is also a little bit convoluted. Like you'd go Beetle, Necromancer into a level 5, have a Beetle on the board already, go into it again. I mean, that's not that hard to do. Like, for example, if you have access to these two monsters, you activate this, revive the Beetle, send the Beetle, go into 2 level 2s. This goes into a level 5. You put the level 5 on the board, and then this is Black Rose. Like, you could do that, don't get me wrong. I feel like it very rarely came up. It may have been one of those things where that's so powerful that you just put Black Rose in the extra deck anyway, because it's just such a powerful play, and it feels like one of those things where the second you cut it, it comes up. But you can make that decision. I'm going to put it in this, let's put it in the deck pile, because I do think the deck having at least 1 level 7 is useful. From there, we can run a quantity of 100 Eyes Dragons. I am aware in the most recent match that I used this deck, I forgot to put 100 Eyes in the extra deck, but it is absolutely a staple. This card combos so well with both Necromancer and Mirage to make it so that you actually have a synchro monster that can continually recur Infernities, particularly Infernity Archfiend from the graveyard, and then search obviously subsequent barriers, launchers, or whatever you need in between. I could totally understand just running 1. In order to actually go into 2, you sort of need double Infernity Mirage in the graveyard, or Mirage and a Necromancer, and there are usually other things that you could do and then just not go into the second copy. So I would understand not running both copies. There are combos, some of the more convoluted combos that enabled you to end with 3 barriers with both of these in the extra deck. So you can make that decision if you actually wanted to allot that second copy of 100 Eyes to the extra deck so that you could make those plays, but I would understand if you were to describe those plays as overkill. Like just having 1 means you can go to double barrier. Why do we really need all 3? So I would understand cutting this down just to 1. From there, other level 8s, we obviously have Stardust Dragon, just a really powerful generic card. We're going to establish a big board a lot of the times. Having Stardust there can help protect it. The most important level 8 to me is Infernity Doom Dragon, just because its name has Infernity in it. It's also pretty useful because main phase 2, you could destroy things like Gores. Not that that card was particularly good against this deck, but you could absolutely do it. If you had access to a Darkened Dragon, which was a prize card, you could consider running it. I actually don't think it was all that great. It wasn't an Infernity, so I think Doom Dragon was just better. I did run in a Darkened Dragon at the 2010 National, so I guess I should have that out just to point out the fact that I did in fact play it, but I think I played it more because it was a prize card than whether or not it was actually any good in this deck. From there, the other level 8 that's absolutely essential is Colossal Fighter, so that we can OTK with Armory Arm. The other one that I think is absolutely essential is 1 copy of Mistworm with Beetle, Necromancer, and Event, and Archfiend. 4, 3, and 2. You can always go into Mistworm, particularly as the first synchro summon, so that you can clear your opponent's board and then use subsequent launchers. From that point, you don't really need any more level 9s. Trishula had yet to be printed yet, because when you have access to those cards, you can just start to go into level 6s and then level 8s. You don't actually need to do that whole iteration, go into level 9, so we only really need 1. From that point, the rest is a little bit debatable. I could see you put another level 5 just because maybe you're afraid of time, or you think you'll eventually need to go into a 3000 attacker. With Kashiliadon, I could totally understand why you might make that decision. I don't think that's necessarily the best decision, but I could totally see why you would include it. A lot of decks at this time did in fact include it, that or even Android. And then a lot of the Americans ran Gaia as opposed to the Splendid Rose package. I like the Splendid Rose package. I'll show you why in a little bit. I was a Splendid Rose fan. But if you're unfamiliar with Infernities, I'm just gonna, before we talk about the side deck, just super simplistic. What's just the absolute bare bones combos that this deck can do? What exactly does Infernity Launcher do, or what exactly did Infernity Launcher do in 2010, and why was it so powerful? Well, I'll show you, because Infernity Launcher has been limited to 1 for a very long time, so you might not be as familiar with what this deck could accomplish if it had access to its combo pieces. So let's say through Infernity Inferno, Dark Grepher, whatever it happens to be, we've established the ideal graveyard, which is a tuner. It honestly doesn't even really matter which one. An Archfiend. This is enough to OTK, but we're going to make it super ideal and actually put the Infernity Necromancer in the graveyard also. So we'll put all 4 of these into the graveyard. And then we'll start off with the normal summon of Infernity Mirage. Let's just make this so that we have a really awesome combo. And you have no hand. That's the whole point of this deck. You need no hand. So we'll use the Infernity Mirage and send it to the graveyard to recur an Archfiend and a Necromancer. And then the Archfiend allows us to search our deck for the first copy of Infernity Launcher. The Necromancer can then special summon from the graveyard a tuner, and you have options here. You want to clear your opponent's board? Here's an option to go into Mistworm. Let's just say your opponent doesn't have any monsters on the board, or any monsters or spell and trap on the board, so there's no point in doing so. So let's go and get a Avenger, and then go all 3 of these into, if that was what I just did, I'd go into 100 Eyes. Because what 100 Eyes then allows you to do is it allows you to banish the Mirage from your graveyard and make it so that the 100 Eyes has Mirage's effect, and then you can tribute this off with its effect, essentially acting as a Mirage, and recur back from the graveyard the Archfiend and the Necromancer. And then the Necromancer will eventually special summon a tuner, but of course we get that Archfiend search. Now we have 2 copies of Launcher that we've yet to use. Here you can then special summon from the graveyard either this to go into level 8, or we can start to go into Beetle if we want to go into level 9s, or eventually get into level 8s. We'll just keep it simple and use this to go into whether it's Stardust Dragon or Infernity Doom Dragon. We always, generally speaking, want to end with Doom Dragon on the board because it's just a 3,000 attack Infernity, and it will keep our Infernity barriers live. But from there, now we can activate Launcher, special summoning Necromancer and Archfiend. We still have 1 copy of Infernity Launcher in our deck, so we can add that to our hand, which is represented as down here. This can now special summon a tuner back, allow us to go into, let's say, Stardust Dragon. We can activate the next Launcher. Here we can start to debate, do we want to go into Necromancer? Do we really need to go into Necromancer? Like, what if we go into just these 2? I would totally find that to be reasonable. It allows you to search out 1 copy of Infernity Barrier, search out a 4-in-1. Then you can crack off the Beetle to search your deck for 2 copies of Beetle. Here is where, a few moments ago, I talked about why I like Splendid Rose, because what it allowed you to do is a lot of times with this deck, you needed to synchro level climb, which I guess is more of a modern term with the words that we use for link climb. But see how I just went into a level 6 so that I could just go into a level 8? Well, when you do that, you put a Splendid Rose into the graveyard. What Splendid Rose allows you to do is when it attacks, if you have another plant monster in your graveyard, you can banish it and make it so that the Splendid Rose can attack again with less attack. It like halves its attack. So it goes from a 22 direct, and then the second attack would be 11. So you could actually do 33 with just 1 monster. And this deck, what it enables you to do is it lets you put a just random dead plant into the graveyard. And then the next time you go into a level 6, that second Splendid Rose actually has an effect because you can banish the plant that was in your graveyard. But just to go back to where we just were, going into another level 8, maybe here we can go into like a Colossal Fighter or something, and you can kind of see where we're going here. I haven't even used this Launcher yet. I can use this to special summon Archfiend and something else. Maybe another level 2 tuner. That's going to search out a second copy of Infernity Barrier. If we went back a little bit in some of this combo, at one of those points earlier, if I went into the second 100 Eyes, which is the conversation I had earlier where you could run a second 100 Eyes, like let's say instead of this Stardust, I went into this 100 Eyes. At the end of this combo, after I go into another synchro here, presumably Goyo is probably the best one, I could actually use the 100 Eyes here and banish, instead of Mirage, I could banish the Necromancer to special summon an Archfiend again. And then at that point, I can search my deck for the 3rd copy of Infernity Barrier. I will caution you to this. If you were to make this play, you risk drawing into something that you can't use. So it actually might sometimes be safer to go into Bryanak here instead of the Goyo, so that no matter what you draw, you can discard it to make it so that your barriers are alive. I mean, your opponent's not breaking this board, right? You have triple Infernity Barrier. Even if they attack over the Archfiend, you still have a 3,000 attack Infernity to keep these live. And you even still technically have Avenger in the graveyard, so if they attack over something, you can recur it so that you still have one in attack mode. I mean, they're not beating this board. This board is really unbreakable, not only in this format, but basically any format. But those are just sort of the bare bones combos. What this deck tries to do is loop Infernity Launcher 3 times, searching as many Infernity Barriers as possible, and depending on the circumstances, OTKing your opponent. Just one more little discussion about combos, just to stress why I particularly like the famous Rose version, the Splendid Rose version. So let's talk a little bit about how simple of an OTK is, just with access to having the Splendid Rose in the extra deck, the 2 copies of Splendid Rose. Let's say these are the 3 cards that you have access to, right? These are in the graveyard, and you have your launcher. Now you activate your launcher, and you special summon these, and you search your deck for another copy of Infernity Launcher. Then you send the Beetle to the graveyard and special summon 2 more copies of Beetle. The Beetle and the Archfiend go to the graveyard, and then you go into your first copy of Splendid Rose. Then you activate the Archfiend, or the Launcher, to bring back the Archfiend and the Beetle, searching your deck for another copy of Infernity Launcher. From there, you can use the level 6 and a level 2 in order to go into a level 8 synchro. Let's just say, for the sake of discussion, we're going to talk about Infernity Doomdragon. Then these 2 can synchro summon into Splendid Rose, and now you can activate the Infernity Launcher again, reviving these 2. And at this point, let's just talk about how much damage that we've established. The 1200 and the 1800 is 3000. This is another 3000. And now this directly is 82, but it's also a little bit more than that because this has the effect of attacking and upping the damage to 33 by dealing a second direct attack by banishing the plant in your graveyard. And because we fuel the plant in our graveyard through this combo, this actually deals way more damage. So even if your opponent has a monster on the board, we can probably still OTK them regardless. And just to reiterate, at the end of this combo, we actually searched a barrier too. So if we don't win, we actually have a barrier set off of the last Archfiend that we searched. So I really liked that Splendid Rose because instead of just using a generic level 6 that had no effect, you could actually later on in the game fuel the Splendid Rose OTKs, which I think were useful. I think the Splendid Rose plays were pretty useful. But those are some of the nuts and bolts combos that this Infernity deck could pull off. As we've done every other deck profile before, let's talk very briefly about the side deck and what are the decks you could have ran at the time. Well, there was, of course, the Mirror Match. Quite frankly, the Mirror Match didn't really run Infernity Break, but just for the sake of what we're doing right now, I'll use that to represent the Infernity Mirror Match. We had the best deck of the format, Frog FTK. I promise I'll be profiling Frog FTK in the near future. There's various gadget decks, which was just a generic anti-meta deck. We had Caliber Cat, a deck that had Airbellum, but not all of the X-Sabers, so we're not talking about Fultrals. We had actual X-Sabers, the deck that Sean used to win the 2010 Nationals. We had Gladiator Beast, a deck that had quite a few spots in the top cut. Adam Korn, Dan Larmatina, for example. We had Frog Monarchs. We had, maybe to a lesser extent, Black Wings, and then Dawn of the Herald plus Herald of Perfection with a bunch of normal monsters. That really frustrating lockdown deck. These are really the top decks at the time. In terms of what Infernities we're going to side, the first thing we're going to do is side the Cyber Dragon package in order to counteract the gadget. So that was one of the things that you could have easily included. A lot of players did. Raikou is a particularly useful inclusion because it fueled your graveyard, potentially putting the Infernities that you needed to combo out into the graveyard. It also destroyed pesky back rows, like Shadowing Prisoning Mirror is really annoying. People might set a card like, let's just say, for example, Crevice. Now, they could obviously chain the Crevice, but you could at least maybe bait it out earlier than they wanted. Maybe you could hit a Dust Tornado or MST. Those cards are actually pretty annoying because your opponent could use them against Infernity Launcher. You could also hit cards like Shallow Flip, or really any of the cards that your opponent could have sided in. It also outs Consecrated Light. Consecrated Light was one of the most annoying cards for this deck because obviously you can't summon Dark Monsters or use Dark Monsters effects. So having non-Dark Monsters in your extra deck was really important, which is actually kind of what Cyber Dragon could theoretically do as well. So Raikou was really useful there. It also outed Thunder King Ryo. It really outed a lot of the things that you needed to worry about. Mike Steinman ran Infernities in top 32 Disc Nationals and ran not only Raikous, he actually ran the third copy and a Super Nimble Mega Hamster to search it out. So he was really hardcore on that Raikou plan out of the side deck. We need additional outs to Thunder King Ryo and then Consecrated Light. So I like the third Book of Moon more than any of them, quite frankly, but a lot of the players elected to run at least one copy of Fissure. Fissure might seem like a weird one. Why not, Smash and Ground, for example? It seems like a way better card. Yeah, but Consecrated Light has no attack and no defense, so we actually just want to kill this thing. We don't want your opponent to have a Sangan on the board, and then the Smash and Ground not kill this little Consecrated Light that's stopping us from OTKing. So Fissure was an unusual card to see in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh!, but actually a card that had some utility here. If I went back to, I would be really afraid of the Herald deck, so the Light Imprisoning Mirrors were a concession to the Herald deck. And then from there, I liked Heroes Rule 2. What Heroes Rule 2 did is it allowed you to have a counter trap for DD Crow. If your opponent targets a card in the graveyard, you activate this, it's a counter trap, it negates it, so it stops a card like DD Crow on your Archfiend. It also stops some of their recursion cards if they're running, for example, X-Sabers with Fall Trolls and Gotham's Call. So I really liked Hero Rule 2 because it not only acted as defense, it also acted as protection. You could run 1, maybe 2, depending. I could see you running a quantity of Divine Wraths. The problem with this deck is this deck wants, obviously, no hand all of the time. So if you're in the middle of a combo and this is your protection trap, as opposed to Hero Rule 2, your opponent could time something perfectly and make it so that you can't DD Crow them. Or rather, can't Divine Wrath their DD Crow, for example. So that one's a little bit debatable. Mind Crush is another one of those that's tough because you need to have a hand to activate this. Even if you know the card is in your opponent's hand, you can't activate this without a hand. This deck's obviously trying not to have a hand. But if you're in the mirror match, this card's really good. You can activate it, hit their launcher, and then maybe that's all you need to survive. If you're playing against the Gold Sarcophagus version of X-Sabers that we profiled not too long ago, you could activate this and hit the card that you know is in their hand off of a Gold Sarc, or even just activate this in response to something like Heavy, Trunade, or Cold Wave, and maybe call one of the cards based on how the game's been progressing. So I could understand running the single copy of Mind Crush, even though this deck doesn't want to have a hand. Additional copies of Dust Tornado is totally reasonable. You don't want to lose out to some of the Floodgates. Quantities of Shallow Flip was an interesting choice too. This card was good against Skyzeris. It was also good against Infernity Archfiend, so it had some utility against some of the top decks at the time. It made it so that if you looked at the extra deck, it covered most of what we're talking about here. Now, if your opponent summons Vanity Fiend against you in the Frog Monarch deck, all right, we've got Book of Moons and Raikos. You're running against the Mirror Match. All right, that's not the greatest thing in the world, but at least we have some Shallow Flips, some Mind Crushes, Dust Tornadoes, Hero Rule 2, etc. Frog FTK, all right, maybe we don't have a lot for Frog FTK. That's the best deck of all time anyway, so we're going to lose to that no matter what. Gadgets, we've got some of the Cyber Dragons, Caliber Cat. I don't think there was maybe a particular card against Caliber Cat, maybe Mind Crush. X-Sabers, we've got plenty of stuff in here. GBs, we actually have some decent cards. Raikos are always good against GBs, Cyber Dragon, Book, Fissure, Flip, Dust Tornado. We actually have a lot against GBs. So this was a nice, well-rounded example of what a side deck would look like. Obviously, it's not 15 exact cards here. You could manipulate some of the numbers to reach there. But regardless, this is what a typical Infernity deck looked like at the Nationals in 2010. This deck, I always like to call the Canadian Infernity deck because it looks really similar to the deck Dale Bolito, Lazaro, Matt Peddle, and a bunch of the Canadians popularized during this format. But regardless, this is Joe Giorlando for Yu-Gi-Oh! History. Thank you for watching. Check back soon as we explore not only the 2010 National season, but a variety of other formats.